Thanks, Guru, for the brief intro. I was a little bit flabbergasted with the title originally chosen for this theme, because it's trying to link development with catastrophic climate change. I thought it'd be catastrophic climate change and ask the question, what sort of development would you have with that sort of thing? So I'm not going to touch too much on development issues, notice, because I thought that climate change itself encompasses all the issues itself. And then I will just show you a few transparencies of slides about this. To get this, the second button, is it? Maybe I have to tell you next, that's all. Okay, I don't know how many of you are not from Malaysia, because I thought this is the original one. And I decided, since I know Malaysia better than the others, I dare not comment on the other countries' development issues. But if you look at the issues in Malaysia, whether they're climate change or not, they've never been holistically addressed. And most of the recommendations on Agenda 21 that rose out of the Rio Summit in Malaysia signed to in 1992 have not been reflected. This was written at that time for the 9th Malaysia Plan. Now, in the 11th Malaysia Plan, there's an attempt being addressed under the rubric of green growth, but I do not know how well it will be addressed. So generally, there's been a lack of political will, absence of holistic planning, fragmented and overlapping agency responsibility. We're just discussing that even in the case of water in Malaysia, checkered enforcement of regulations, inequitable distribution of tax revenues between federal and state governments. That's behind especially the water issue, because a lot of state governments rely on revenue from natural resources for the income. They do not, especially if they're controlled by the opposition, they do not have a fair share of the tax revenue that are collected by the federal government. And for a long time I've advocated that one way to address actually many environmental problems is to review our constitutional provision between federal and state levels in terms of access to tax, income tax especially. Patronage dominates with attendant corruption, both in the public and private sectors. Then there's a massive problem with lack of public accountability and opaqueness in decision making and awards of contracts. Next, please. Go back. Now, I always like this cartoon of Latt. Because of the hill slope development that we have been promoting, especially in the Klang Valley, this is what happens. Development in progress, you build all these houses, and suddenly the whole landslide, hill gives way. And what progress have you got left? And yet people want to buy houses on up on slopes. So in a way, consumers still, despite this, want that sort of thing, despite knowing the risks. Next. Then this is just to look at another issue. In other countries, you go and look for an elephant graveyard. In Malaysia, you look for toxic waste graveyard. Toxic waste from Selangor dumped in Pahang, and yet this plantation never said anything about it. The fellow who disposed the thing never said about it until somebody located the site and it became an issue. So that's one of the ways we try to dispose waste. So we will throw waste, whether it's toxic or not, when nobody can see it until it's found. Next. Can you go back? That's my favorite. Himalaya and Hill Malay. This is like the development issues. In Malaysia, we don't like hills, ratakan. Civil engineers like to build on flat areas. They don't want to build on contours. Although there's enough experience all over the world, and people like me have been shouting for donkey years, saying, build along slopes. And I remember one of the early issues of Alam Sekitar, the magazine that EPSM published while I was around, wrote an article on how to develop along contours, sort of thing. But the excuse they gave is, it's better to mobilize all the vehicles at one go and flatten everything and remove all the vegetation and let it erode. And therefore you have erosion and silting. That leads to the next issue. The next. Floods. Why do we have floods? All the time. Why? Because the drains, of course, are designed for a certain amount of flow rate, but because there's siltation and erosion going on all the time, all the drains are silted up. Their carrying capacity is reduced by half or more. So all you need is just a bit of heavy rain. All the rainwater is being drained away, gets flooded up. And I get amazed. New highways, new traffic light in section 19 in PJ, where they call it a Rothman's roundabout. Now they've got traffic lights there. You go there, it only rains for half an hour and you see floods at the place. Federal Highway, for donkey years, you get floods. And if you are a cyclist, then only you can see all the exits to the silt exits are blocked up. So the water cannot flow out to the drains. The drains are there, but you block the entrance. That's what happens. Next. Let me now go to climate change and talk about the science. Next. Most of you are aware of this principle. Why is global warming occurring? Basically due to the solar radiation. The solar radiation is the infrared component. Maybe Gary will talk about a bit, but I thought I will lay the foundation behind it. That we had a part of the greenhouse belt in the atmosphere, even in the past, that allowed the Earth's atmosphere to be at level where H2O particles existed as water. But because we are now beginning to emit more and more CO2 and other gases, the greenhouse belt has become thicker, so more and more of the infrared radiation is coming reflected back to the Earth. That is leading to global warming. Global warming leads to climate change. We must get the sequence correct. Greenhouse effect is essential, and because it's worsening, then we are having climate change. Not climate change directly can be linked, because climate change is a number of parameters. Those of you who know anything about climate change, it's not heat alone. Next. And this is quite an old slide, but I like using it because I remember the first time when I went to these climate negotiations, I was told by the northern NGOs that the main source of global warming was deforestation. And I asked them, excuse me, where's the science behind it? I said, what about the energy? Because I'm basically an electrical engineer by training, and I know the link between energy and climate change. So then they push. So now, if you look at it, almost 65%, some people say 70%, is the burning of fossil fuels, combustion, energy usage. And deforestation, basically not just cutting for logging alone, because the carbon is still locked in the trees, but the felling and burning, not a tropical forest, I still argue whether it's just tropical forest. Any forest, doesn't matter. Reeds, much less. Some people argue now it's 15%, some people say 12%. But the order of priority is important. First, burning of fossil fuels. That is a major. Then other forms of burning. Then decay, methane coming from rice fields, especially wet rice fields, chemical fertilizers, cattle farms, all ruminants, and our famous rubbish dumps. All the organic material that you throw in the dumps degrades, generates methane. And methane is 21 times of global warming effect than CO2. And finally, all these gases that were produced, we try to resolve the ozone depletion problem by coming up with new gases, but the new gases turn out to be higher global warming effect. Okay, next. And then this is the historic rise. I'm sure Joy may be able to update the figures compared to this, but these figures were taken about last year before the last IPCC report. But you notice almost all the gases, if you look at pre-industrial level, 2005, 2011, they've been all going up. And most of the gas increases began actually after the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, pre-industrial is a good reference. They talked about setting the limit of CO2 as 350 ppm. We have exceeded that. We have now even exceeded 400 ppm. Next. And these were WMO press release of 2003 showing the various monitoring stations and how the temperatures have been going up. Next. And what are the impacts? This is where climate change has two basic characteristics. One is increase of temperature, the other one is precipitation changes, and the third element is the rise of sea level. Sea level, of course, is linked to temperature as well. Because the temperatures go up, more of the Arctic polar ice cap is melting, the ocean is heating up. As it heats up, it expands. So these are the three elements you need to worry about when you're talking about climate change. And the impacts on health, especially in vector-borne diseases, agriculture, in the shifting of agricultural lands, forests, because trees cannot walk to higher temperatures, cooler temperatures. So the forests die out. Then water resources are affected. The keynote speaker has already mentioned something about water resources in the context of water supply in this country. Aquatic life. A lot of us tend to forget about aquatic life. Yet we depend on fisheries. Fisheries is an important source of protein. Coastal areas. Main impact on coastal areas is due to sea level rise. And of course, As a result of this combination, species and natural areas are affected. There was an article in Nature magazine many years ago that predicted by 2020 or 2030, something that 30% of the existing species would be wiped out, not because of man, but because of climate change itself. Next. And these are the linkages. I'd like to show this slide to show that nothing in the environment is in isolation. Climate change by itself has links with air quality, ozone, biodiversity, forest, desertification. They interact on each other. And that is the complexity of the ecosystems, basically. Next. Now, I'd like to show this thing because many people argue this is a problem created by developed countries. This is what is likely to happen. This was 2000. By now, of course, the graphs have changed. Global emissions are still going up. Developed countries have been going up. But by 2020, developing country emissions will equal that. This is based on an annual basis. If you look cumulatively, next one. Next. Cumulative. Cumulative, we have a bit more time because we started late on the emission game. We want to talk about it. We have about 2080, 2087, and they will equal. So it's no longer a problem just of developed countries alone. We are actively also contributing towards it. You know, when I went around 10 years ago giving talks to different parts of the country, whether the late Mr. Chow, many people in Malay, in Kuching, Sarawak, and Sabah said, why do you bother? It's not a problem. It's a problem created by the US. Why do you want us to do anything? And I think that attitude has to change. Next. Now this was the last IPCC stuff. I'm sure the new IPCC stuff projection will be very different. Even according to that, there will be major impacts if temperatures goes up to 3 degrees above the baseline, which is last century itself. And I'm sure Moro and British government actually was telling me they got new charts which show even more dramatically regional impacts. But this is to just give you a flavor of what the taste is going to be like. And this was taken from the Straits Times, basically. At that time, I didn't have access to the IPCC report. Next. So what are the issues? Global warming affects all. I'd like to emphasize this. No human or ecosystem is immune. Nobody is immune to climate change. And we all contribute in many ways. And we are all starting to pay the cost, which will rise over time. Some are more culpable and should act now. These, to me, are the biggest emitters. Like in the past, we used to talk about the USA, but now China, total emissions have become higher than US. But this was something I predicted right at the beginning of the negotiations. I told the developing countries, you need to get the developed countries to start coming in. Otherwise, the rate at which you are developing, you will overtake. And it's happened. Now, they're very clever. They push the blame also to developing countries. They say, if you don't move, we are not going to move. To me, the whole world is suffering because of that attitude. And Malaysia is the third highest emitter per capita within ASEAN. First is Singapore, second is Brunei, third is Malaysia, then Thailand is very far behind on a per capita basis, remember. Then CO2 concentrations have already passed 400 ppm. We were talking of 350 ppm as a limit, and we have passed that limit. Next. You can press again. Now, I want to remind you, press again. I want to emphasize the Convention's objectives, which is supposed to cover climate change. Stabilization of greenhouse gases in order to ensure, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference. Anthropogenic is man-made interference, so that the ecosystem could adapt naturally. Why? To ensure food production is not threatened and to enable sustainable development. Those are keywords. So ultimately, the convention, if properly implemented, is supposed to ensure sustainable development. But in the convention discussion, sustainable development is very often forgotten. Hardly, a few people who raise, hey, developing countries should address this in the context of the need for sustainable development, not just for other reasons alone. Next. But even with 92, scientists were warning that greenhouse gas emissions had to be reduced 80% below 1990 levels by the year 2000. They also stated CO2 concentrations in the greenhouse belt need to be kept at 350 ppm. But where are we? We have passed, as I said, 400 ppm. So what the scientists themselves said, 1990 levels, bring down to 80% 1990 level by the turn of the century. It was stated in the convention. But turn of the century has been good flexibly to be 2005, 2010, unending turn of the century. So political expediency. Next. And underlying principles. Precautionary principle is one of them. But this had been undermined by the USA and others who said we are absolute scientific certainty, despite the IPCC reports becoming more and more certain. I agree that initially the IPCC reports had a fairly high level of uncertainty, which was exploited. But then you were supposed to apply the precautionary principle. Then common but differentiated responsibilities. This is the basis of the Kyoto Protocol and the idea of Annex 1 grouping and not Annex 1. But this has been cast aside because even Japan, the country after which the Kyoto Protocol came, has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol itself. Australia has withdrawn. US never was a party to the thing. Historical liability was the other thing, because when the convention was adopted in New York in 1992, before Rio, I was there, and Malaysia was the only country that stood up and said, we will not sign this convention. Of course, we signed eventually. But one of the reasons was, it was not a fair convention. And people touted it as an equitable convention because it took into account the issue of historical liability, which now is being pushed away more and more by the developed countries. They say, forget about that. That was discussion of the last century. We are now in the 21st century. Those parameters don't apply anymore. Okay, next. Climate change is a global threat, but it's submerged in politics. This is what I find many scientists have gone to these negotiations and come back very frustrated because they find the science is totally ignored and politics and economics dominate. But in a way, inevitable because it is intergovernmental document. Next. But more so because in the case of the Climate Convention, there's a whole range of Western interests at stake. The oil industry, the rich countries, the powerful ones. Then there are those who believe they will suffer adversely, pitted against those who are considered historically the largest greenhouse gas emitters. Next. There's a marked north-south divide. OECD versus non-OECD. Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1. Even now, although it's sort of scaled down, then even within G77, which is, I observe with great frustration, they are divided between OPEC and the rest. AO6 was China, India, and Brazil. Like the first COP held in Berlin was supposed to consider a protocol, which was drafted by AO6. But because AO6 did not consult China and India, they sabotaged it and made sure it was not even tabled at the first COP. So they had to come with a resolution which eventually led to the Kyoto Protocol itself. So powers, politics within G77. Next. One more. You see the title? While all the talk is going on, this is the reality. The sea levels are rising. The more you can do the reports is to reinforce your raft. Next. So what is political? In some countries, anything that's critical of the ruling party is considered political. Anti-government, and therefore you blended anti-government, anti-national. I've gone through this phase. But to me, politics is the mobilization of citizens' concerns and capabilities to govern and achieve sustainable development. We must rephrase the definition of politics. And politicians, to me, are mere agents for the achievement of the people's aspirations, not the masters that they make themselves out to be. Politics, I think, the only profession that sets its own yardsticks and all that. Nevertheless, other people set the yardsticks. But I think the citizen should set the yardsticks for them. Accountability. Next. And this has been very old cartoon, taken from the days, from the initial thing, when the Americans were asking the South to take action, clean up, and they said, you, the North, created the emissions, and now you're asking the developing countries to whitewash your emissions. The debate between luxury emissions and survival emissions was at that stage. Next. So the racking has started. Jim Henson was one of those chaps who talked about the 350 ppm. He has said weather extremes are costly, hot weather is becoming more frequent and intense, rains and typhoons are also severe, global temperature could easily reach 4 degrees, some people say even 6 degrees. Our future is under extreme threat. And the recent IPCC working group report adds more alarm to this issue. Next. Joy will talk more about the IPCC afternoon, so you can ask her the question. So to me, this is a fundamental development theme. Can the affluent in all countries be made to make sacrifices in many wasteful areas and assure that they will still have a good quality of life? And in the case of developing countries, the real challenge is, can they, especially large nations in China and India, tone down the aspirations of the citizens for even higher energy resource usages with the possibility of still having a better quality of life. If I were to take transport as an example, can you imagine if the Chinese allow the citizens to all own a car each? Where will the world's resources be to make all the cars, and what will the emissions be? Could they not, since there are no progressive in all these high-speed trains and all that, tell the citizens, what is the purpose of cars? Accessibility. We will provide you accessibility in more efficient way through efficient public transport and encourage public transport. You don't have to own a car. I remember being very frustrated at one of the side events of one of the COPs, where this Chinese representative came and talked about sustainable development. Then halfway through his talk, he says, one of the criteria of sustainable development is for China to have as many kilometers of railway track per capita as Japan. I say, excuse me, how does China with sustainable development? You know what's the size of the Chinese population? How many thousands of kilometers of railway track would you need to build? Will there be enough railway track still to provide all the railway tracks? So I think there is this misnomer. One hand we talk about sustainability, on the other hand we use a conventional yardsticks for development. Next, and that's probably one of my last slides. I think mass media and civil society actually have a role. Mass media has to monitor and report on how well emission reductions are being done. If you look globally, the interest in climate change from the mass media has gone up and down. Initially in Rio there was some interest, then it faded away. Kyoto, there was some interest, then it faded away. The next peak came in Copenhagen. After Copenhagen, it's faded. Now it's supposed to build up to Paris next year. I don't know. So the question is, and especially when I go to the COPs and all that, I find that southern media is very, very absent. And now at least the Chinese media is almost always present at every one of the COPs. And they report very well. I haven't seen the Indian media very drastically. Malaysian media has been erratic. In Kyoto, I remember there were 3 Malaysian journalists, Tan Cheng Lee, Pang, and one more person, 3 people. The last few COPs, Hillary was around at one stage, but now Hillary appears there more as Third World Network rather than the Star itself. So I don't see, Bernama will only go when the PM is there. I remember in Copenhagen, I didn't even know that TV3 had a journalist there until the Prime Minister was, and she introduced herself. Oh, yeah, I'm from TV3. I said, oh, why are you here? Oh, because the PM is here. So our media follows the PM, not the issues sort of thing. Right? So I think there's a mismatch, and you may want to ask yourselves tomorrow, why is it that you pick and choose and you do not actually know much of the issue itself, background? How do you do a background? Why did the PM make that commitment? In what context was it in? Yeah. So civil society definitely needs to expose shortcomings, but it needs the help of the media. In a way, now I think the situation changed a little bit because we have social media. So civil society is the other outlet. When we were relying on mainstream media, it was at their mercy. When the editors say, okay, you can give some coverage to climate change, most editors say, what for? Climate change is not a newsworthy issue at the moment. And I think this is the problem with climate change. You cannot tie very many newsworthy things with climate change because climate change is insidious. The effect of climate change are felt much later, much more than water pollution. Water pollution, you can see fish dying. Climate change is very difficult to provide visuals until the massive droughts and animals are dead and so on. I remember when I wanted to produce a video on climate change in Malaysia, I was challenged to find graphics, local scenes, which could be dramatic enough to motivate people. Couldn't find them. Now maybe you can get some of the drought areas and so on. The last slide. Next one. Oh, last one. I like to always show this thing because, not that I'm just a cyclist freak, but I think this is drawn by a Dutch NGO that actually shows how cycling is the most energy efficient mode of transport and therefore produces less CO2 compared with all other modes. But it's limited to about 5 kilometers. Beyond 5 kilometers, it doesn't. The things change. Cyclists, 1 energy of 1 day. Person walking, energy of 3 eggs. Bus loaded requires equivalent 2 dozen eggs. Loaded bus, remember? Typical car, with a single person requires 7 dozen eggs. Even if you double the capacity of the car and you double the fuel efficiency and you double the occupancy, you still require 21 times the energy of a bicycle. So the model of it, where the terrain allows you and where its distances are not too big, cycling is the most efficient. But do we make cycling possible? Now only DBKL is doing that over weekends. And I was laughing. I said, if I want to cycle to DBKL, I have a challenge. How to get to the cyclist path that DBKL is going to put along the Klang River? I have to reach the Klang River first. How do I get to the Klang River? Because there are no dedicated tracks. Even when I last time cycled to DOE in 1980, and when we were Jalan Piramli, the only cycle track, the only safe track I was supposed to have access to on the federal highway is the motorcycle track. And you know, motorcycle tracks are not safe. My good friend, the late Fan Yu Teng, got knocked down by a motorcyclist along the track itself. So we need to have those things. We need to facilitate this. But I notice at least now that people are beginning, at least local authority level, beginning to talk about making facilities available for cyclists. But they've still not come with dedicated continuous cyclist lane. Even in PJ, the track they're talking us outer ring. I said, what's use of your outer ring? I have to get to your outer ring in order to reach MPPJ. How do I get to your outer ring from SS2? Next. So ultimately, I want to say nothing comes easy. If you want to help global warming, you just keep pointing fingers because 3 fingers are pointing back to you. What are you doing? What is your country doing? We need to act. That this has been my cry. I'm fed up of all the talking. I keep all this negotiated and asked them. I said, don't you think you're morally irresponsible? You emit so much emissions to fly to these negotiations. What have you produced that makes a difference? The global emissions are still going up despite your 20 years of negotiations. And sustainable development and sustainability will not occur if global warming worsens. And ultimately, the main challenge is point out the inequities and stop being hypocritical, especially among multinationals and the rich. Thank you.